So, there I was, sitting on my couch, knee-deep in a family-sized bag of Doritos. Because, let's be real, emotional distress officially makes nacho cheese a food group. I mean, who needs kale when you've got a crunchy, artificially orange snack that doubles as both dinner and therapy? It was one of those nights where the universe had decided to kick me in the shins, and I was just trying to survive. My boyfriend, let's call him Greg because that's his name, and I'm not feeling creative enough to protect his identity, was in the other room, doing whatever it is Greg does when he's not ignoring me. Probably reorganising his sock drawer or something equally thrilling. Anyway, I was mid-chip, contemplating whether I could justify eating the entire bag in one sitting. Spoiler, I could, when his phone buzzed. And not just any buzz. No, this was the buzz. The kind of buzz that makes you sit up straighter, like you've just heard the opening notes of a true crime podcast. Greg, who had been half asleep on the recliner, did this weird little jump scare thing, like he'd just been caught smuggling contraband in a prison movie. He grabbed his phone so fast you'd think it was on fire, and his face did this whole panicked twitch thing that was honestly kind of impressive. Now, I'm not usually the suspicious type. I don't go through his phone or stalk his social media or anything like that, but come on. When someone reacts to a text like they've just been handed a live grenade, you can't help but wonder what's going on. My first thought was that it was his mum. She's the kind of woman who still calls him Snookums and sends him texts like, "Did you remember to floss today, sweetie?" But then I remembered that Greg's mum is technologically challenged and still thinks emojis are a form of witchcraft. So, probably not her. My second thought was that it was something shady. And by shady, I don't mean he was secretly planning a surprise birthday party for me. Though, let's be honest, that would have been shocking enough. No, I mean the kind of shady that makes you want to throw his Xbox out the window and change the Wi-Fi password. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I just sat there, crunching on another Dorito, pretending I hadn't noticed his little freakout. Of course, my brain was already spinning wild theories. Maybe it was his boss telling him he'd been fired. Or maybe it was his best friend inviting him to a guys' weekend that I wasn't allowed to know about. Or maybe, and this is where my imagination really went off the rails, it was a secret admirer sending him cryptic love notes written in invisible ink. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you get the idea. The point is, I was curious. And not just casually curious, like when you wonder what's in the mystery meat at a potluck. No, this was full-on, can't think about anything else, might actually go insane curious. But I didn't say a word. I just kept eating my Doritos, pretending everything was fine because that's what I do. I bottle things up until I explode, usually at the most inconvenient moment possible. Little did I know. This was just the beginning. That buzz was the first domino in a chain reaction that would eventually lead to me fleeing the country, adopting a puffin, and becoming best friends with a man who sells fermented shark for a living. But at that moment, all I knew was that something was off. And as I sat there, covered in Dorito dust and existential dread, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I was still on the couch, still covered in Dorito dust, and still trying to convince myself that Greg's weird phone behaviour was nothing to worry about. But let's be real. When your boyfriend acts like he's just been caught plotting to overthrow the government because of a text, it's kind of hard to ignore. I mean, I'm not a detective, but even I know that level of panic doesn't come from a message about pizza delivery. Anyway, Greg eventually wandered off to take a shower, which, by the way, is his go-to move whenever he's trying to avoid a conversation. It's like his version of a magician's disappearing act, except less impressive and more infuriating. But this time, his little escape routine worked in my favour. The second I heard the water turn on, I made my move. Now, before you judge me, let me just say this. I'm not proud of what I did. Snooping through someone's phone is basically relationship sin 101, and I know that. But in my defense, I wasn't planning to go full-on spy mode. I just wanted to see who had texted him. You know, a quick peek, like when you glance at someone's grocery cart in the checkout line to see if they're buying something embarrassing. Harmless, right? Wrong. The second I unlocked his phone, don't ask me how I knew his passcode. Let's just say it's not exactly Fort Knox level security. I was greeted by a wall of text. And not just any text. Oh no. This was the kind of message that makes you feel like you've accidentally walked in on a private therapy session. It was long, emotional, and filled with so much nostalgia, it could have been written by a Hallmark card. The sender? Sarah. Now, if you're thinking, who's Sarah? Congratulations, you're smarter than I was. Because I knew exactly who Sarah was. She was Greg's first love, his high school sweetheart, the one who got away, and apparently she was also the one who still had his heart, because their conversation was basically a love letter to the past. I'm talking paragraphs about the way the sunlight hit the lake that summer, and remember when we thought we'd grow old together. It was like reading a romance novel, except instead of feeling warm and fuzzy, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. And the worst part, Greg wasn't just responding with polite one-liners. No, he was fully participating in this trip down memory lane, writing things like, "I've never stopped thinking about you," and "Those were the best days of my life." Meanwhile, the most romantic thing he said to me in the last 6 months is, "You're out of milk again." I sat there, staring at his phone, feeling like the world's biggest idiot. How had I not seen this coming? How had I missed the signs? And more importantly, how was I supposed to unsee what I just read? The water was still running in the bathroom, so I knew I had a few more minutes before Greg came back. But instead of putting his phone down and pretending I hadn't seen anything, I kept scrolling. I know, bad idea. But at that point, I was in too deep. I needed to know how far this went. Turns out, it went pretty far. Their texts weren't just a one-time thing. They'd been talking for weeks, months, maybe. And it wasn't just casual chit-chat. They were planning to meet up. Nothing official yet, but there were a lot of, "We should catch up sometime," and "I'd love to see you again." By the time I heard the shower turn off, I was in full-blown crisis mode. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, and I was pretty sure I was about to throw up. But instead of confronting Greg like a mature adult, I did what any self-respecting woman would do in that situation. I put his phone back exactly where I found it, wiped my fingerprints off with my sleeve, and pretended everything was fine. Because, you know, nothing says healthy relationship like bottling up your emotions and eating an entire bag of Doritos in one sitting. After the great phone snoop of 2023, I was a mess. My brain was a chaotic whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, confusion, and, of course, the lingering taste of nacho cheese. I sat there on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, which was playing some infomercial about a revolutionary mop that could apparently change my life. Spoiler, it couldn't. But at that moment, even the mop seemed to have its life more together than I did. Greg came out of the shower, blissfully unaware that his world was about to implode. He was humming some annoying tune, towel around his waist, and had the audacity to look happy. Meanwhile, I was sitting there like a human storm cloud, ready to unleash my fury. But did I? Of course not, because apparently I'd rather internalize my feelings than have an actual adult conversation. Instead of confronting him, I started imagining all the ways I could confront him. In one scenario, I calmly sat him down and said, "Greg, we need to talk about Sarah." In another, I threw his phone at his head and screamed, "Who's snookums now, huh?" And in my personal favourite, I hired a skywriter to spell out cheetah above our house. But none of those scenarios actually happened, because when it comes to confrontation, I'm basically a turtle. I retreat into my shell and hope the problem goes away. So, What did I do? I stewed. I stewed like a pot of soup left on the stove too long, bubbling over with resentment and passive-aggressive comments. When Greg asked if I was okay, I said, "Oh, I am fine," in a tone that clearly implied I was anything but. When he suggested we order pizza for dinner, I replied, "Sure, as long as it's not from Sarah's pizzeria." He didn't get the hint, obviously, because men are notoriously bad at picking up on subtext. The days dragged on, and the weight of what I'd discovered grew heavier. I kept waiting for the perfect moment to bring it up. But there's no such thing as a perfect moment when your boyfriend is emotionally cheating on you. Every time I thought about saying something, my throat would close up, and my brain would go into overdrive, convincing me that it wasn't worth the fight. Maybe it's not a big deal, I tell myself. Maybe I'm overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't overreacting. The texts I'd read weren't just harmless flirting, they were a full-blown emotional affair. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Not just at Greg, but at myself for letting it go on for so long. Why was I so afraid of confrontation? Why couldn't I just stand up for myself? The breaking point came one night when Greg was out with his friends. I was home alone eating ice cream straight from the tub because at this point, why bother with bowls, when I decided to check his phone again. I know, bad idea, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and I was nothing if not curious. This time, the texts were worse. Sarah had sent him a photo of herself, looking all glamorous and perfect, with a caption that said, "Remember this?" And Greg's response? How could I forget? That was it. That was the moment I snapped. But instead of confronting Greg like a rational human being, I did something completely irrational. I packed a bag, booked a one-way ticket to Iceland, and left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Heard you're still in love with Sarah. Enjoy the milk." Looking back, it was probably the most dramatic thing I've ever done. But in that moment, it felt like the only option. I couldn't confront him because I didn't trust myself not to cry or scream or throw something. So I ran, and honestly, it was the best decision I ever made. So there I was, standing in the middle of nowhere, Iceland, with a suitcase full of questionable life choices and a heart full of regret. The airport had been a blur of chaos, delayed flights, lost luggage, and a security guard who seemed way too interested in my stash of emergency chocolate. But somehow I'd made it, and by made it, I mean I'd landed in a place so remote that even Google Maps had given up trying to locate it. The village I'd chosen, if you could even call it that, was basically a postcard come to life. Rolling green hills, jagged mountains in the distance, and sheep. So many sheep. They were everywhere, like fluffy white lawn ornaments that had come to life and decided to take over the world. It was picturesque, sure, but also kind of eerie. I half expected one of them to start talking, or demand I solve a riddle before letting me pass. My cabin, which I'd booked online in a fit of desperation, was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly the Ritz. It was small, rustic, and smelled faintly of wet dog and regret. The Wi-Fi was practically non-existent, which meant I couldn't even stalk Greg's Instagram to see if he was crying over me. But hey, at least the view was nice. If I squinted hard enough, I could almost pretend I was in a rom-com montage complete with a swelling soundtrack and a makeover sequence. The first person I met was Bjorn, the local eccentric who seemed to be the self-appointed mayor of the village. He was a tall, burly man with a beard that could have housed a family of birds, and a laugh that sounded like a chainsaw revving up. He introduced himself by offering me a plate of fermented shark, which, for the record, is not something you should ever offer someone who's just stepped off a 12-hour flight. "It's a delicacy," he said, grinning like he'd just handed me the keys to the kingdom. "It smells like regret," I replied, trying not to gag. But despite his questionable taste in food, Bjorn was surprisingly welcoming. He gave me a crash course in Icelandic culture, which mostly consisted of him pointing at things and saying, "That's a sheep," and "That's a rock." By the end of the tour, I felt like I'd earned a PhD in rural Icelandic studies. As the days went by, I started to settle into my new life. The cabin, while not exactly luxurious, had a certain charm. The walls were thin and the heating was spotty, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. Of course, there were challenges. The Wi-Fi situation was a nightmare, and I quickly learned that Icelandic weather is about as predictable as a toddler on a sugar high. One minute, the sun would be shining, and the next, I'd be caught in a hailstorm that felt like the sky was personally attacking me. But despite the hardships, I found myself enjoying the simplicity of it all. There was something freeing about being so far removed from my old life, from Greg, from everything. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Greg showed up. But that's a story for another time. Bjorn quickly became a fixture in my new Icelandic life, which was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, he was the closest thing I had to a friend in this remote village. On the other hand, he had an obsession with fermented shark that bordered on pathological. I'm not exaggerating when I say he brought it up in every conversation, like it was his personal mission to convert me to the cult of Hakao. "You haven't truly lived until you've tried it," he said one afternoon, holding out a piece of what looked like dried leather but smelled like a dumpster on a hot day. "I'm good, thanks," I replied, trying to back away without being obvious. But Bjorn wasn't one to take no for an answer. He followed me around the village, waving the shark in my face like it was a trophy he'd won in some bizarre culinary competition. "It's an acquired taste," he insisted, as if that made it any more appealing. "So is dirt," I muttered under my breath. Despite his questionable culinary preferences, Bjorn was surprisingly good company. He had a knack for storytelling and could turn even the most mundane events into epic tales of adventure. One day, he told me about the time he had chased a sheep through a blizzard because it had stolen his hat. "It was a battle of wills," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief, "and I won." I couldn't help but laugh. There was something refreshing about Bjorn's unapologetic eccentricity. He didn't care what anyone thought of him, and that kind of confidence was contagious. As the days went by, I found myself warming up to him, and not just because he was the only person around to talk to. He had a way of making me feel at ease, even when I was knee-deep in my own existential crisis. One evening, as we sat by the fire in his cosy little house, he finally managed to convince me to try the fermented shark. "Just one bite," he said, holding out a piece with a look of pure triumph on his face. I hesitated, staring at the offending morsel like it was a live grenade. But something about Bjorn's unwavering enthusiasm made me cave. "Fine," I said, taking the piece with trembling fingers. "But if I die, I'm haunting you." The first bite was an experience. The texture was rubbery, and the taste was like nothing I'd ever encountered before. A bizarre combination of ammonia, fish, and regret. I gagged, my eyes watering as I struggled to swallow. Bjorn burst out laughing, his booming voice filling the room. "See? Not so bad, right?" "Not so bad," I choked out, reaching for a glass of water. That was the worst thing I've ever put in my mouth. But despite the horror of the fermented shark, I couldn't help but laugh along with him. There was something oddly bonding about the experience, like we'd just survived a traumatic event together. From that day on, Bjorn became my unofficial guide to Icelandic life. He taught me how to knit badly, introduced me to the local sheep, who were surprisingly good listeners, and even tried to teach me a few Icelandic phrases. My favourite was "Eg er ekki astvangin af þér lengur," which means "I'm not in love with you anymore." It felt fitting, given the circumstances, but as much as I enjoyed Bjorn's company, there was still a part of me that felt lost. I'd come to Iceland to escape my problems, but running away hadn't solved anything. If anything, it had just given me more time to think about everything I'd left behind. Life in rural Iceland was nothing like I'd imagined. Sure, I'd expected the sheep and the stunning landscapes, but I hadn't accounted for the sheer unpredictability of it all. Every day felt like a new adventure, complete with its own set of challenges and absurdities, and somehow, amidst the chaos, I found myself starting to embrace it. Take the sheep, for example. At first, they were just background noise, fluffy white blobs dotting the hillsides. But the more time I spent in the village, the more I realised they were basically the unofficial mascots of the place. They were everywhere, and they had no regard for personal space. I'd be walking to the tiny village store, which, by the way, sold exactly 3 things: bread, milk, and Bjorn's fermented shark. And suddenly, there'd be a sheep blocking my path, staring at me like I owed it money. At first, I found it annoying, but over time, I started to see the humour in it. I mean, how could you not laugh when a sheep literally followed you home and stood outside your cabin, bleating like it was trying to have a conversation? I named that one Gary. Gary and I became unlikely friends. He'd show up every morning and I'd toss him a piece of bread. Don't judge me. It's not like there was much else to do. Then there was the weather. Icelandic weather is its own special brand of chaos. One minute the sun would be shining and I'd think, hey, maybe today's the day I'll finally figure out my life. And the next, I'd be caught in a hailstorm so intense it felt like the sky was personally attacking me. I learned to always carry a raincoat, even if it looked sunny outside. And if I forgot? Well, let's just say I spent a lot of time drying off by the fire in Bjorn's house. Speaking of Bjorn, he was a constant source of entertainment. Whether he was trying to convince me to try another Icelandic delicacy, spoiler, it was always fermented shark, or regaling me with stories of his misadventures, he never failed to make me laugh. One day, he showed up at my cabin with a puffin perched on his shoulder. "This is Olaf," he said, as if it were completely normal to have a puffin as a pet. "Why do you have a puffin?" I asked, staring at the bird, which stared back at me with what I can only describe as judgment. "He followed me home," Bjorn said with a shrug. "Thought you might like him." And that's how I ended up with an emotional support puffin. Olaf was an experience. He had a personality bigger than Bjorn's beard and a penchant for stealing shiny objects. My cabin quickly became a treasure trove of stolen spoons, buttons, and one very confused-looking rubber duck. But as chaotic as my new life was, there was something oddly comforting about it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living in the moment instead of constantly worrying about the future. I wasn't thinking about Greg or Sarah or the mess I'd left behind. I was too busy trying to figure out how to knit a scarf. It ended up looking more like a lopsided net, or chasing Olaf around the cabin to get my earrings back. Of course, there were still moments when the weight of everything hit me. Late at night, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, I'd find myself thinking about Greg and the life I'd left behind. But even then, I didn't feel the same crushing sadness I had before. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace. While I was busy embracing my new life in Iceland, befriending sheep, dodging hailstorms, and trying to keep Olaf the puffin from stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, Greg was back home, apparently losing his mind. I hadn't blocked his number, mostly because I wanted to see how long it would take him to notice I was gone. Turns out it didn't take long at all. The first text came about 2 days after I'd left. It was short and to the point. "Where are you?" I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to let him stew in his own guilt. But another part of me, the petty part, wanted to string him along, to make him sweat a little. In the end, I decided to do nothing. Silence, I figured, was the most powerful response. But Greg wasn't one to give up easily. Over the next few days, the texts kept coming, each one more desperate than the last. Are you okay? This is insane. I can't believe you left over a few texts. That last one made me laugh out loud. A few texts? Really? He'd been writing full-on love letters to his ex, and he had the nerve to act like I was overreacting. If anything, I'd underreacted. I mean, I could have set his Xbox on fire or keyed his car, but instead, I'd chosen the high road. Well, the high road that led to rural Iceland, but still. The texts kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. We need to talk. I miss you. Please come home. I didn't respond to any of them. Not because I didn't have things to say. Trust me, I had plenty. But because I didn't trust myself not to say something I'd regret. Like, I hope Sarah enjoys your sock drawer organisation skills. Or, enjoy the milk, Snookums. Instead, I focused on my new life. I spent my days exploring the village, learning how to knit, badly, and trying to teach Olaf some basic manners, also badly. But no matter how busy I kept myself, Greg's texts were always there, lurking in the back of my mind like a bad smell. One night, after a particularly long day of chasing Olaf around the cabin, he'd stolen my favourite scarf and was using it as a nest, I finally caved and read through all of Greg's messages. There were dozens of them, each one more desperate than the last. I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make it right. Please, just talk to me. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should have given him a chance to explain. But then I remembered the texts I'd read, the ones where he'd poured his heart out to Sarah, the ones where he'd talked about their sunlight on the lake moments. And just like that, the guilt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I didn't owe Greg anything, not an explanation, not a second chance, not even a response. I'd left for a reason, and no amount of desperate texts was going to change that. But as much as I tried to convince myself I was over him, there was still a part of me that wondered what would have happened if I'd stayed. Would we have worked things out? Or would I have spent the rest of my life playing second fiddle to Sarah? I didn't have the answers, and maybe I never would. But one thing was clear. I wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And then, just when I thought I'd finally put Greg out of my mind for good, he showed up in Iceland. It was a crisp, clear morning in Iceland, the kind where the air feels so fresh it's like the world has hit the reset button. I was out for a walk. Olaf the puffin perched on my shoulder like some kind of bizarre pirate accessory when I saw him. At first, I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe the fermented shark had finally gotten to me, or maybe I'd been spending too much time with Bjorn and his endless stories. But no, there he was, standing in the middle of a sheep field like a lost tourist. Greg. My first instinct was to turn around and run, but where would I go? It's not like Iceland has a lot of hiding spots, unless you count the occasional lava cave, and I wasn't exactly dressed for spelunking. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I stood there frozen, while Olaf squawked indignantly and flapped his wings like he was trying to warn me of an incoming storm. Greg spotted me almost immediately. He looked, well, terrible. His hair was a mess, his clothes were wrinkled, and he was holding a bouquet of flowers that were already wilting in the cold. He started walking toward me, his face a mix of relief and desperation, and I felt my stomach twist into knots. "What are you doing here?" I asked when he was close enough to hear me. My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, but honestly, I think I deserved a pass under the circumstances. "I came to find you," he said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "No kidding," I replied, crossing my arms over my chest. Olaf, sensing the tension, hopped off my shoulder and waddled over to Greg, pecking at his shoes like he was trying to figure out if they were edible. Greg looked down at the puffin, then back at me. "Is that a bird?" "His name's Olaf," I said, as if that explained everything. Greg blinked, clearly thrown off by the fact that I now had a puffin as a sidekick. But to his credit, he didn't comment. Instead, he held out the bouquet of flowers, which were now looking even sadder than before. "I brought these for you." I stared at the flowers, then at him. "You flew all the way to Iceland to give me wilted flowers?" "I flew all the way to Iceland to apologise," he said, his voice cracking a little. "I messed up, okay? I know I did, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at him, to tell him exactly how much he'd hurt me. But another part of me, the part that had spent weeks stewing in my own anger, just felt tired. "How did you even find me?" I asked, because honestly, that was the part I was most curious about. Greg shrugged. "It wasn't easy. I called every airline, every hotel. I even tracked down Bjorn. He wasn't exactly helpful, but he did tell me where you were." Of course he did. Leave it to Bjorn to throw me under the bus. I made a mental note to have a word with him later, preferably while holding a plate of fermented shark as a threat. "Look," Greg said, taking a step closer, "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm here and I'm not leaving until you at least talk to me." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to tell him to take his wilted flowers and shove them where the sun doesn't shine. But instead, I just felt conflicted. Because as much as I hated to admit it, there was a part of me that had missed him. But before I could say anything, Olaf decided to intervene. He let out a loud squawk, flapped his wings, and then, in a move that can only be described as pure chaos, snatched the flowers out of Greg's hand and flew off with them. We both stood there, watching as Olaf disappeared into the distance, the flowers trailing behind him, like some kind of bizarre parade float. "Wow," Greg said after a long pause. "That's not how I saw this going." "Welcome to Iceland," I replied, unable to suppress a smile. And just like that, the tension was broken. But the real conversation was still to come. After Olaf's dramatic flower heist, Greg and I stood in the middle of the sheep field, staring at each other like two actors who'd forgotten their lines. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint smell of damp grass and, inexplicably, fermented shark. I wondered if Bjorn was nearby, lurking with his signature dish like some kind of culinary spectre. "So," Greg said finally, breaking the silence, "can we talk?" I crossed my arms, trying to look stern, but it's hard to maintain an air of authority when a puffin has just stolen your ex-boyfriend's peace offering. "Talk about what? The fact that you've been texting your ex like you're co-writing a romance novel? Or the fact that you thought showing up here with dead flowers would fix everything?" Greg winced, running a hand through his messy hair. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I'm here because I want to make things right." "Make things right?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Greg, you don't get to just show up and say you're sorry and expect everything to be okay. Do you have any idea how much you hurt me?" He looked down at his feet, his shoulders slumping. "I do, and I hate myself for it. But I swear, it wasn't what you think. Sarah and I... It was just nostalgia. It didn't mean anything." "Nostalgia?" I snapped. "You were talking about growing old together, Greg. That's not nostalgia, that's emotional cheating." He flinched at the word, and for a moment I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it was quickly replaced by a wave of exhaustion. I was so tired of being angry, of feeling like I had to defend myself against his excuses. "Look," I said, taking a deep breath, "I don't know what you want from me. You hurt me, and I left because I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. And now you're here expecting... what? Forgiveness? A second chance?" Greg looked up, his eyes pleading. "I don't expect anything. I needed you to know how sorry I am. And if you'll let me, I want to prove that I can be better. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the truth was, I didn't know if I could trust him again. And more importantly, I didn't know if I wanted to. Greg, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if I even want to try. But what I do know is that I'm not the same person I was when I left, and I'm not going back to the way things were. He nodded, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. I get that. And I'm not asking you to, I needed you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes, even if that means starting over. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, to go back to his life and let me move on with mine. But another part of me, the part that remembered the good times, the part that still cared, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. Before I could respond, Olaf reappeared, landing on my shoulder with a triumphant squawk. He was still holding the remains of Greg's flowers, which were now little more than a few mangled stems. Greg looked at the puffin, then at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he smiled. I guess he's not a fan of roses. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension between us easing just a little. Olaf has very strong opinions about floral arrangements. Greg chuckled, and for a moment, it felt like old times. But the moment passed quickly, and we were left standing there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I'm not making any promises, I said finally, but I'm willing to talk. If you're serious about making things right, then we'll take it one day at a time. Greg nodded, his expression serious. That's all I'm asking for. And just like that, the confrontation was over. But the real work was just beginning. After the confrontation in the sheep field, Greg and I walked back to my cabin in silence. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, and every step felt like a mile. Olaf, ever the drama queen, flapped ahead of us, occasionally glancing back as if to make sure we were still following. I half expected him to start narrating our awkward journey in his own puffin language, complete with dramatic pauses and judgmental squawks. When we reached the cabin, I gestured for Greg to sit on the rickety wooden bench outside while I went in to make tea. It wasn't that I was trying to be hospitable, more like I needed a moment to collect my thoughts. As I filled the kettle and rummaged through my sparse collection of tea bags, I couldn't help but wonder how I'd ended up here. A few weeks ago, I'd been eating Doritos on my couch, blissfully unaware of the emotional grenade about to explode in my life. Now, I was in rural Iceland, serving tea to the man who'd broken my heart while a puffin watched us like a nosy neighbour. When I brought the tea outside, Greg was staring at the horizon, his expression unreadable. He took the mug I handed him with a quiet, "Thanks," and for a few minutes, we just sat there, sipping our tea and avoiding each other's eyes. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "I know I don't deserve another chance," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But if you're willing to give me one, I'll spend every day proving that I'm worth it." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared into my mug, watching the steam curl up into the cold air. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to believe that people can change and that second chances are worth taking. But another part of me, the part that had packed up and left the country without looking back, wasn't ready to let go of the hurt. "Greg," I said finally, setting my mug down and turning to face him, "I need you to understand something. I didn't leave because I wanted to punish you. I left because I needed to figure out who I am without you. And I'm still figuring that out." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and hope. "I get that, and I'm not asking you to rush anything. I needed you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere until you tell me to." I took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. It would have been easy to send him away, to tell him that I was done and that he should go back to his life. But the truth was, I didn't want to. Not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I wasn't ready to close the door completely. "Here's the deal," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not making any promises. I'm not saying we're getting back together or that everything's going to be okay. But if you're serious about making things right, then we'll take it one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just see where it goes." Greg's face lit up, and for a moment he looked like the man I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd made me laugh and feel like I was the most important person in the world. "That's all I'm asking for," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. This wasn't a happily ever after moment. It wasn't even a guarantee that things would work out. But it was a start. As we sat there, sipping our tea and watching Olaf chase a butterfly, or maybe it was a piece of lint, it was hard to tell, I realised that this was what I'd been missing. The possibility of something better, not just with Greg, but with myself. The decision wasn't easy and it wasn't final, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own story, and that was enough. After the emotional whirlwind of Greg's arrival and our tentative agreement to take things one day at a time, life in Iceland settled into a strange but comforting rhythm. The days were long and unpredictable, filled with moments that felt like they belonged in a quirky indie film. If someone had told me a few months ago that I'd be living in a tiny cabin, raising a puffin, and navigating the complexities of a fractured relationship, I would have laughed in their face. But here I was, doing exactly that, and somehow it felt right. My days started early, usually with Olaf pecking at the window to be let in. He'd waddle over to the kitchen, where I'd pour him a bowl of water and toss him a piece of bread. He'd developed a taste for it, much to Bjorn's dismay. Then I'd make myself a cup of tea and sit by the window, watching the sun rise over the hills. There was something magical about Icelandic mornings, the way the light painted the landscape in shades of gold and pink, the way the air smelled like salt and earth. It was the kind of beauty that made you forget, even for a moment, about all the chaos in your life. Greg had taken a room at the village's only guest house, a cosy little place run by an elderly couple who seemed to find our situation endlessly entertaining. He'd stop by the cabin most mornings, usually with some excuse like, "I thought you might need more firewood," or "I found this book at the guest house and thought you'd like it." It was sweet, in a clumsy, awkward way, and I couldn't help but appreciate the effort. We didn't talk much about us. Not at first, anyway. Instead, we focused on the little things. He'd help me chop wood or fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, and I'd teach him how to knit, badly, or introduce him to the sheep, who were still sceptical of him. It was strange, rebuilding a connection through mundane tasks, but it worked. There was no pressure, no grand gestures, just two people figuring out how to be around each other again. Bjorn, of course, was a constant presence. He'd show up unannounced, usually with some new Icelandic delicacy for me to try. I'd learned to politely decline the fermented shark, or a story about his latest misadventure. One day, he arrived with a pair of handmade wool socks, claiming they were essential for surviving Icelandic winters. I thanked him, even though it was July and the socks were bright pink with yellow polka dots. As the weeks went by, I started to feel more at home in Iceland. The village, which had once felt so foreign and isolating, began to feel like a sanctuary. The people were kind and welcoming, even if they did find my attempts at speaking Icelandic hilariously bad. And the landscape, rugged, wild, and breathtakingly beautiful, felt like a reflection of my own journey. But it wasn't all peaceful sunrises and knitting lessons. There were moments of doubt, too, times when I wondered if I was making a mistake by letting Greg back into my life. On those days, I'd take long walks through the hills, letting the wind and the silence clear my mind. And always, always Olaf would be there, waddling beside me like a tiny, feathered therapist. Greg and I still had a long way to go. Trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired, and there were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was setting myself up for more heartbreak. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I wasn't rushing into anything, and I wasn't running away. I was just living. And as I sat by the fire one evening, watching Greg struggle to knit what he claimed was a scarf, it looked more like a lopsided net, I realised that this was enough. For now, at least. Greg's presence in Iceland became a quiet but steady force in my life. He didn't push or demand anything. Instead, he showed up day after day with a kind of quiet determination that was hard to ignore. It wasn't grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was the little things. Like the time he spent hours fixing the cabin's leaky roof, even though he was terrified of heights. Or the way he'd bring me a cup of tea every morning, exactly how I liked it, without me having to ask. At first, I was sceptical. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to slip back into old habits or give up when things got hard. But he didn't. Instead, he surprised me. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Greg handed me a notebook. It was plain and unassuming, the kind you'd find at any store. But when I opened it, I was stunned. Inside were pages filled with his handwriting, letters, poems, and stories, all about us. Not the idealised version of us that he'd been clinging to with Sarah, but the real, messy, complicated us. "I've been writing these for a while," he said, his voice hesitant. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to show you how much you mean to me, not just in words, but in actions too." I flipped through the pages, my throat tightening as I read. There were memories I'd forgotten, little moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had clearly meant something to him. Like the time we'd gotten caught in the rain and ended up dancing in the parking lot, or the way I'd always hummed off key while cooking dinner. "You remembered all this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes earnest. "Every detail. I know I messed up, and I know I can't change the past, but I want to be better. For you, for us." It was hard to stay guarded after that, not because the notebook fixed everything. It didn't, but because it showed me that he was trying, really trying, and for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But Greg's redemption arc wasn't just about us. It was about him, too. He started spending more time with Bjorn, learning about Icelandic culture and even trying, and failing, to knit his own scarf. He'd sit with the sheep, talking to them like they were old friends, and he'd help out around the village, chopping wood or fixing fences for anyone who needed it. One day, he even tried fermented shark. It was a disaster. He gagged so hard I thought he was going to pass out. But the fact that he'd tried at all meant something. Bjorn, of course, found it hilarious and declared Greg an honorary Icelander, which mostly involved giving him a ridiculous nickname and making him wear a hat made of sheep's wool. As the weeks turned into months, I started to see a different side of Greg. He was more patient, more thoughtful, more willing to listen. He didn't try to rush me or pressure me into making decisions. Instead, he gave me the space I needed to figure things out on my own terms. And then, one night, as we sat under the northern lights, he said something that caught me off guard. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice soft but steady. "And I don't expect us to go back to the way things were. But I want you to know that I'm here, for as long as you'll have me." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I leaned back, watching the lights dance across the sky. They were breathtaking, shimmering greens and purples that seemed to stretch on forever. And in that moment, I realised that I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't have to know what the future held, or whether we'd make it. All I had to do was take it one day at a time. "Okay," I said finally, turning to look at him. "Let's see where this goes." And just like that, the next chapter of our story began. The northern lights were out in full force that night, painting the sky in swirls of green and purple, so vivid it felt like the universe was putting on a show just for us. I stood outside the cabin, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, with Olaf perched on the railing beside me. He had become my constant companion, my feathered confidant, and tonight he seemed as mesmerised by the lights as I was. Greg joined me a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He handed one to me without a word, and we stood there in silence, watching the sky. It was one of those moments that felt too big for words, like anything we said would only cheapen the beauty of it. But eventually, Greg broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft but steady, "about us, about everything." I glanced at him, curious, but not wanting to interrupt. "I know I don't deserve you," he continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And I know I can't undo the mistakes I've made. But I want you to know that I'm committed to this, to us, to being the person you deserve." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I took a sip of my hot chocolate, letting his words sink in. They were the kind of words I'd wanted to hear for so long, but now that they were here, I wasn't sure how to feel. "Greg," I said finally, turning to face him, "I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if we'll make it or if we'll crash and burn. But what I do know is that I'm willing to try. Not because I owe it to you, but because I think we're worth it." He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance to prove that we can be better. Together." We stood there for a while longer, watching the lights dance across the sky. It felt like a new beginning, not just for us, but for me. I'd come to Iceland running from my problems, but I'd stayed because I'd found something worth fighting for, not just with Greg, but with myself. As the night wore on, Olaf grew restless, flapping his wings and squawking like he was trying to remind us that he was still there. I laughed, reaching out to scratch his head, and he leaned into it, his eyes closing in contentment. "I think he approves," Greg said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Of course he does," I replied. "He's the one who's been keeping me sane this whole time." Greg chuckled, and for a moment it felt like old times. But it wasn't old times. It was something new, something fragile, but full of potential. As the lights began to fade, we headed back inside, Olaf trailing behind us like a tiny, feathered shadow. The cabin was warm and cozy, the fire crackling in the hearth, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Greg and I would make it or if we'd end up going our separate ways. But for now, in this moment, I was happy. And that was enough. As I sat by the fire, watching Greg struggle to knit yet another lopsided scarf, I realised that this was what I'd been missing. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic declarations, but the quiet, everyday moments that made life worth living. And just like that, the story that had started with a bag of Doritos and a broken heart came full circle.